Fiber-optic drones remain one of the most challenging things the Ukrainians face along the front lines, but they seem to have an idea how to combat the pilots of them, a very creative one actually. But we'll talk about this as well as about anything else that has happened along the front lines and behind them in this situation report about the war in Ukraine. The Ukrainians are saying the Russians keep striking the electricity, the energy infrastructure inside of Ukraine. The Russians themselves also accuse the Ukrainians of continued strikes against the energy infrastructure. In recent Russian attacks with drones and ballistic missiles, numerous civilians were once again killed. We'll switch to the developments along the front line, and here we have the Russians advancing into the area here of Velyka. Here we have a geolocation of this, that the Russians have reached the northern part of Velyka, where they raised a flag. The Russians also advanced in the Ukrainian bridgehead inside of Russia. Here at this point, to the east of Oleshna, they managed to get forward. We have this here. We see the road here, and Oleshna is here, so roughly between Melovi and Oleshna, to have an orientation point. So the Russians more or less should be at this point here now, pushing the Ukrainians further back. The Russians also managed to advance in Belgorod, where the Ukrainians were recently in Demidovka. We have a geolocation of the Russians now being in the northern part of the town again, showing that they managed to push the Ukrainians somewhat back in this area. That was it from the Kursk region. We switched to the Kharkiv region, and while there is no change on the ground that can be observed, the Ukrainians are reporting that the Russians are increasingly are more active in the area of Vovchansk. Here, in the last 3 weeks, more Russian attacks happened. The Ukrainians think this is because additional reinforcements have arrived. The Ukrainians are also saying more mechanized attacks are happening, so the Russians got reinforcement and heavy equipment, even though that has not turned into some successes along the front line that I can observe. So the front line seems to be remaining unchanged. We switch to the developments along the front line in the eastern front, and here we have the Russians advancing north of Kupiansk. We have geolocations of the Russians being in the northern part of Kindrashivka here. And this is right north of Kupiansk along the road towards Zapatne and Vorichina. Here the Russians managed to advance further out from their bridgehead over the Oskil River towards the west and are now at the outskirts of Kindrashivka. The Russians also were successful further south here in the rough area of Ternu. We have a geolocation of the Russians to the west of Novosilka. We see that here, and this is a tree formation that is pretty clearly visible, showing us that the Russians are now here. So that area is probably mostly under Russian control or in the process of getting it. The Russians thus managed to extend their foothold over the Oskil on the western side. South of the Seversky Donetsk, I do not have any changes until we come to the area of Chasiv Yar. So in Seversk, nothing is being reported. And while in Chasiv Yar, I cannot confirm any changes along the front line. We have an interesting report here that fiber-optic drones are the biggest problem in the area here. In an interview, the soldier reported that as soon as Ukrainian electronic warfare is appearing, the Russians switching to fiber-optic drones. The only thing that is helping against them are anti-drone nets that we've seen popping up roughly 6 to 8 weeks ago. They are already spreading everywhere. And this is an interesting development, though. We have here the claim that the Ukrainians light up the cables from the fiber-optic drones, which then would obviously transmit the light and thus allow the Ukrainians to find from where those drones were launched. Then they use surveillance drones to look for the Russian pilots to reappear to then strike them. Whether or not this is going to be turning out successful is obviously unclear as of now. It might be smarter too to use infrared light to not make it visible with the naked eye, but that basically leaving breadcrumbs to where you start your drones from could be a bad idea, is quite logical in itself. That's it from this area. We switch to Toretsk, and here we have some changes. First of all, the Ukrainians are getting shelled in Druzhba. A Russian tank is shelling Ukrainians here in Druzhba, confirming continued Ukrainian presence in the town of Druzhba here. This is roughly at this point where the Ukrainians were here. The Ukrainians also struck Russians at the stadium here. And the interesting part here is that they were on the western side of the stadium where they haven't been spotted before. And according to the reports, the Ukrainians heard them talking on the radio, planning to blow up the building where the Ukrainians are in west of it. This would confirm that the Russians have not just reached this point, but that the Ukrainians are very likely still in this building at this very moment. That was it from this area. Further south, we have confirmation of the Russians in the center of Olexandropil. We have that here. So the eastern part of the town is likely under Russian control as of now. We switch to the Pokrovsk area, and here we have the Russians on the outskirts of Bodanivka. This is in the west here. Here, the Russians managed to reach that point. And the Russians also gained additional ground southeast of Zaporizhzhia, where they've recently advanced in this area. But that was it from Pokrovsk as well. Ukrainian military spokesperson for the region is saying the Russians are increasingly putting their focus on the eastern part of Pokrovsk, so they are no longer trying to envelop Pokrovsk over the western axis, but they are increasingly doing it over the eastern axis, also to cut the lines of communication. This line here towards between Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka is likely cut as the Russians are directly at it, but there are obviously some sideways in the north, some secondary roads that can be used, and here it seems the Russians are aiming to cut those as well. Further south in the Ravkorakhove area, we have confirmation now that Rozliv has fallen to the Russians. We have geolocations of them being in the northwestern part of town and in the eastern part of town. So the town of Rozliv is now very likely completely under Russian control. To the west of it, in the Velyka Novosilka area, the Russians have entered Novosilka. We have that geolocated here. See the Russians west of the north-south road, showing that the Russians have roughly reached this point here as of now. That was it from this area. We have one more change in territory that is in the Zaporizhzhia region, where the Russians have started an offensive in the direction of the city itself. Here the Russians were recently in Lobkove, and now we have a geolocation of them being at this point here. You see the road turning, and they have reached this here over the last few days, so gaining an additional small advance. That was it with the developments along the front line. So overall, the Russians retain the strategic initiative. The Ukrainians managed to hold out somewhat in Kursk, but obviously the time seems to be ticking against the Ukrainians, and their venture into Belgorod is under pressure too. To which degree the Ukrainians are still in Belgorod is unclear as of now. Other than that, while the front line is moving, it is still fairly stable. Rapid advances by the Russians are not visible. Even advances like this that have been somewhat rapid are no comparison to what we've seen last year, in the second half of last year, when the Russian gained pace. We still have a slower progress continuing of the Russians, and I just read that this is supposedly the third month in a row where the Russian advances have slowed down. In the political sphere, we have to continue talk about ceasefires. Russia is demanding a reconnection of banks towards the SWIFT system and the lifting of sanctions against certain areas to sign a ceasefire on the Black Sea. This is clearly slowly being understood in the White House. As Trump said in an interview, if I think Russia is tapping the US along, I will not be happy about it. Supposedly, there are also thoughts how to increase sanctions towards Russia and what else in political means are possible. But the most obvious one, obviously, to increase military pressure, does not seem to be in the books in the White House. At the same time, Russia is trying to bait the United States with resource deals, among them resource deals for rare earth inside of Russia, which would then seems to be aiming to make a Ukraine resource deal less attractive for the United States and thus bind Russia more to the US than Ukraine. Ukraine is still getting aid, though. The Dutch have just announced that they are going to give 500 million euro. That should be like $560 million for Ukrainians' drone projects. Part of it, this is part of the overall 2 billion package that the Dutch have made, signed and created for the Ukrainians in 2025. So additional aid from Europe is coming, and the aid has increased in the recent weeks when it comes to Europe, obviously with the prospect of the United States no longer willing to aid. Europe is slowly stepping up. Whether it will be enough or not is far too early to say, but we'll obviously observe it here on the channel. So if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. It helps with the algorithm. If you're new here, I would like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss future videos. This channel is only possible because of the support of viewers like you. If you like to support the channel, you can do so by the means in the description. But that's it from me for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back.